The sound of bronze striking limestone echoed across the hills surrounding Jerusalem as the first light of dawn touched the city of David. Thousands of workers had already descended into the quarries, their tools biting into stone that would never be shaped by their own hands into walls they would never see completed. This was the invisible foundation, the preparation that history often forgets, the groundwork laid in shadow, while a king wrestled with a burden heavier than any stone his workers would ever lift. David stood upon the roof of his palace, cedar beams imported from Tyre stretching above his head, walls paneled with the finest wood the ancient world could offer. Yet his eyes remained fixed on the tent below, modest and temporary, housing the Ark of the Covenant. The contrast burned in his conscience daily. He dwelt in luxury, while the presence of God remained sheltered in fabric and poles, no different than it had been in the wilderness 40 years before. The king's desire was clear, his resources vast, his intent righteous. But the divine prohibition was absolute. You are a man of war. You have shed blood. You will not build my house. The restriction did not halt the work. It merely transferred the glory to another generation while leaving David to shoulder the preparation. And so began the accumulation that would define the final decades of his reign. 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, bronze beyond measure, iron in quantities that strained the kingdom's capacity to mine and smelt. Diplomatic negotiations with Hiram of Tyre secured promises of cedar and cypress, the fragrant wood that would one day line sacred walls. But promises required payment, and payment required taxation, and taxation required the cooperation of tribes still adjusting to centralized royal authority. In quarries surrounding Jerusalem, the secret work intensified. Master stone cutters from Gabal arrived to train Israelite workers in techniques that would produce blocks of unprecedented precision. Each foundation stone was measured according to specifications David himself had received, dimensions revealed in moments of prophetic clarity when the Spirit showed him what Solomon must build. The daily reality was brutal. Workers rose before dawn, descended into pits where limestone waited in massive beds, and spent hours marking, cutting, and splitting stones that weighed tons. Bronze tools, not iron, were required for this work. The temple site itself would hear no sound of metal striking stone when assembly began. Every block must arrive perfectly shaped, ready to fit seamlessly into its appointed place. The labor force grew steadily. 30,000 Israelites were organized into rotating shifts, 1 month in Lebanon cutting timber, 2 months at home. Another 150,000 workers, primarily from the Canaanite populations David had conquered, formed the permanent workforce. Over them stood 3,600 supervisors enforcing quotas, maintaining pace, ensuring quality. The cost in human terms was never recorded. Injuries went undocumented. Deaths were absorbed into the vast machinery of national ambition. Families saw fathers and sons vanish into the quarries for weeks at a time, returning exhausted, hands calloused and bleeding, lungs thick with stone dust, bodies aging faster than their years. David knew what he was asking. The preparations consumed resources that might have built roads, fortified cities, or eased the burden on farmers struggling with taxation. Yet the mandate was clear. The house of God required excellence beyond human preference. It demanded sacrifice that transcended comfort. And so the king pressed forward, accumulating materials, training craftsmen, organizing systems that would outlast him. When death finally came, David delivered to Solomon not merely a throne, but an unfinished obligation. The foundation stones were cut. The cedar was promised. The workers were trained, but the real work, the impossible task of raising walls that would contain the presence of the Almighty, that burden now passed to a son who had never swung a hammer or felt limestone dust coat his throat. And the price would be measured not in gold already gathered, but in human endurance not yet spent. The quarries themselves were a landscape of coordinated violence against stone. Limestone beds stretched across the hills surrounding Jerusalem, white rock waiting beneath thin soil, and upon these beds descended an army of workers whose daily existence was defined by dust, heat, and the relentless demand for precision. The mandate was absolute. Every stone must be cut to exact dimensions in the quarry itself. No iron tool could touch rock once it reached the temple site. The silence required there meant the brutality must happen here, in pits where the sound of bronze hammers striking copper chisels created a cacophony that never ceased from dawn until darkness. Made further work impossible. Tens of thousands of laborers worked simultaneously across multiple quarry sites. The scene was choreographed chaos. Workers marked stones according to specifications delivered from Solomon's master builders, measurements precise to the breadth of a hand. Teams of men positioned themselves around massive blocks, bronze tools raised, and at the foreman's signal brought their hammers down in unison. The technique was ancient but effective. Copper and bronze, softer than iron, required more strikes but produced cleaner breaks in the sedimentary limestone. The rhythm was hypnotic and exhausting. Strike, reposition, strike again. Hours passed in repetitive motion, shoulders burning, hands blistering, the smell of sweat mixing with stone dust that coated everything and everyone. The heat was merciless. Midday sun turned the quarries into furnaces where men worked until they collapsed, replaced immediately by others from the endless supply of conscripted labor. Water was rationed, carried by boys too young for quarry work but old enough to understand the hierarchy of suffering they would soon join. Each stone was tested before acceptance. Master craftsmen examined cuts, rejected imperfections, sent workers back to correct errors that might compromise the integrity of walls they would never see assembled. The precision required was staggering given the tools available, yet the stones emerged one after another, shaped to specifications that would allow them to fit together without mortar, without gaps, without the need for adjustment on sacred ground. The human cost accumulated in silence. Hands were crushed when stones shifted unexpectedly. Men were buried when quarry walls collapsed, lungs filled with fine dust that turned breath into a rasping struggle after years of exposure. The labor force was divided by status and origin. 30,000 Israelites served in rotating shifts, 1 month cutting timber in Lebanon, 2 months at home, attempting to maintain farms and families. But 150,000 foreign workers, descended from Canaanite populations that had survived Joshua's conquest, worked permanently. They had no rotation, no relief, no return home. Over them all stood 3,300 supervisors, themselves Israelites, enforcing quotas that seemed designed to break bodies before spirits. Fathers taught sons the craft in the quarries, passing down techniques with the grim knowledge that both generations were bound to this work until the temple stood complete. 7 years for the house of God. 13 more for Solomon's palace complex. An entire generation would spend their productive years extracting stone from the earth, yet there was a strange dignity in the precision required. These blocks would form the foundation of the dwelling place of the Most High. The thought sustained some, others simply endured, and each evening, as cut stones were loaded onto sledges and dragged by oxen and men, toward Jerusalem, the workers could see in the distance the hill of Moriah, where an entirely different kind of labor was transforming their brutal handiwork into something approaching the sacred. But cutting stone was only the beginning. The impossible task of raising them skyward waited, and on Mount Moriah, an army of craftsmen prepared to transform raw material into sanctuary. Mount Moriah had been a threshing floor before it became sacred ground. The same place where Abraham had bound Isaac centuries earlier now served as the platform where stone would rise into walls that would house the presence of God Himself. The site preparation alone required months of labor. Earth was moved, bedrock leveled, massive foundation platforms constructed to create a flat surface where the temple would stand. And then came the miracle that defined the entire construction. No hammer would strike stone here, no chisel would shape rock on this holy ground. Every block arriving from the quarries was already complete, already shaped, already prepared to fit perfectly into its appointed place without adjustment or tool. The organization required was staggering. Different crews handled different materials and different tasks. Masons positioned toward the massive limestone blocks, directing teams of workers who used wooden rollers, bronze levers, and coordinated human strength to move stones that weighed as much as several oxen combined. Carpenters worked with the cedar that arrived from Lebanon, timber so fragrant that its scent filled the construction site and drifted across Jerusalem on the wind. Metalworkers labored over bronze and gold, creating overlay and decorative elements that would transform functional walls into objects of beauty. Each group worked under master craftsmen who understood not merely construction techniques, but the sacred purpose behind every measurement. Dawn brought priests to the site before workers arrived. Offerings were made, prayers lifted, the ground sanctified for another day of labor. Then the rhythm began. 100 men or more would surround a single foundation stone, ropes secured, wooden beams positioned as levers, and at the foreman's command they would lift, shift, position, adjust, until the block settled into place with a precision that seemed impossible given the tools available. The engineering was brilliant in its simplicity. Ramps allowed stones to be dragged upward as walls rose higher. Pulleys multiplied human strength. Coordination replaced individual effort. And slowly, course by course, the structure grew. Lebanese cedar arrived on carts pulled by teams of oxen, each beam already cut to specification by Phoenician craftsmen who understood timber in ways Israelite workers were still learning. These foreign experts worked alongside Solomon's men, teaching techniques, demonstrating joinery methods, sharing knowledge that would be needed for generations of temple maintenance. The tension was present but muted. Gentile hands were building the house of the God of Israel. Foreign skill was necessary for Hebrew worship. The contradiction was noted but accepted. Excellence required expertise, regardless of its source. Gold work began while walls were still rising. Thin sheets of hammered gold were prepared to overlay cedar panels that would line the interior. The process was delicate and demanding. Gold had to be beaten until thin enough to bend but thick enough to last. Craftsmen worked in covered areas away from dust, their tools precise, their standards absolute. Nothing flawed could be accepted, nothing imperfect could remain. The same standard applied to every element. Bronze workers cast the massive pillars that would stand at the temple entrance, Jachin and Boaz, each requiring such quantities of metal that the bronze was not weighed but estimated by volume. Weavers created fabric for the veil that would separate the holy place from the most holy. Threads dyed in colors so expensive that the material itself represented wealth beyond what most Israelites would see in a lifetime. Midday brought inspections. Solomon's appointed overseers walked the site, examined work completed that morning, approved or rejected based on standards that never relaxed. A stone positioned incorrectly was removed and reset regardless of the labor required. Cedar panels showing the slightest imperfection were replaced. The progress was measured not in speed but in perfection. Years passed and the structure rose inch by inch, course by course, until the exterior stood complete and attention turned inward to the most sacred space of all. The Holy of Holies, the inner sanctuary where only specific workers could enter, where the Ark would eventually rest, where God Himself would dwell. The workforce decreased as sanctity increased, and while walls reached skyward, another community prepared for duties that would last far longer than construction itself. The temple rising on Mount Moriah demanded more than stone and cedar. It demanded an entire economy reorganized around a single purpose, and the daily reality of that reorganization touched every family in Solomon's kingdom. Feeding 180,000 workers required grain shipments that arrived in endless procession, carts groaning under sacks of wheat and barley harvested from fields across Israel. Livestock moved in herds along dusty roads, cattle and sheep driven toward Jerusalem, where slaughter awaited. The scale was staggering. Every day demanded thousands of loaves, hundreds of animals processed into meat, water transported in quantities that kept carriers moving from dawn until darkness made the paths too dangerous to navigate. Bakeries operated in shifts that never stopped. Ovens fired through the night produced bread that fed men whose labor burned through calories faster than rest could restore them. The wood required to maintain those fires was itself a massive undertaking. Forests were cut, timber hauled, fuel stacked in piles that disappeared daily into flames that baked the bread that sustained the workforce that built the house of God. Slaughterhouses near the workers' camps ran with blood, the butchering constant, the smell permanent. What emerged was distributed according to status. Supervisors received better cuts. Skilled craftsmen ate more than common laborers. Foreign workers received enough to survive, but rarely enough to satisfy. The hierarchy was maintained even in rations. The economic burden fell hardest on those furthest from Jerusalem. Farmers who had worked their own land for generations now found themselves conscripted into a system that took their sons for labor and their harvest for taxation. A family's entire year could be disrupted when the father was called for his month of service cutting timber in Lebanon or hauling stones in the quarries. Fields went untended, crops were planted late or harvested poorly. The women left behind carried double burdens, maintaining households while husbands and sons fulfilled obligations to a building project they would likely never see completed. Children learned early that royal ambition extracted its price from common people, a lesson that would bear bitter fruit when Solomon's son inherited a kingdom exhausted by his father's vision. Trade relationships maintained the flow of exotic materials. Hiram of Tyre received payment in wheat, oil, and wine for the cedar and craftsmen he supplied. The amounts were enormous: 20,000 cores of wheat annually, 20,000 baths of oil. The wealth flowing out of Israel to sustain construction created dependencies that bound kingdoms together through economic necessity. Peace was maintained not through treaties alone, but through mutual benefit. Yet the benefit was unequal. Tyre grew richer. Israel grew more indebted. The temple was being built on borrowed prosperity. Workers' camps surrounding Jerusalem formed temporary cities larger than most, permanent settlements. Tents stretched in organized rows, family groups clustered by tribe and origin. Communal cooking fires created pillars of smoke visible from miles away. Women ground grain, prepared meals, tended children who knew no life except this one defined by their father's absence and their mother's exhaustion. The social divisions were sharp and visible. Israelites kept separate from Canaanites. Free workers avoided conscripted slaves. Even among Israelites, those serving rotating shifts maintained distance from those permanently assigned to construction oversight. Status determined everything from tent location to food quality to the likelihood of surviving the project with health intact. Entertainment was scarce and simple. Exhaustion dominated. Men returned from work sites too tired for anything beyond eating and collapsing onto sleeping mats. The Sabbath brought relief for Israelite workers, a day when religious obligation provided rest that bodies desperately needed. But foreign laborers had no such guarantee. Their rest came when overseers permitted it, and overseers measured productivity against quotas that never decreased regardless of weather, injury, or human limitation. Children grew up watching construction that seemed eternal. They learned trades by necessity, apprenticing to craftsmen, absorbing skills that would be needed for decades of temple maintenance after completion. A boy might watch his father return each evening covered in stone dust, hands bleeding, and understand that this would be his own future. The generational burden was accepted because the purpose was sacred, but acceptance did not eliminate resentment. The northern tribes especially began to calculate the cost of southern ambition. Their resources fed Jerusalem's glory while their own cities remained modest. The accounting would come due. But not yet. For now, construction continued, and while workers built walls, Levites prepared for service that would outlast stone. The physical structure neared completion, but the spiritual purpose still waited to be fulfilled. 7 years after the first foundation stone was positioned, the temple stood complete. The final details consumed weeks of meticulous work. The bronze sea cast by Hiram of Tyre and requiring the strength of dozens of men to position was settled onto the backs of 12 bronze oxen facing outward toward the compass points. Golden lampstands were installed in the holy place, their flames designed to burn continuously, never extinguished. The table of showbread was positioned, the altar of incense placed before the veil, every furnishing arranged according to specifications delivered through David and executed by Solomon. The workers who had labored for years watched from a distance as sacred objects were carried into spaces their hands had built, but their feet could never enter. The ark's journey from the city of David to the temple was a procession that drew the entire nation. Pilgrims flooded Jerusalem until the city could barely contain them. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation that bordered on fear. This was the moment when architecture would become sanctuary, when human work would be tested by divine presence. Solomon had prepared sacrifices beyond counting, and as the ark entered the Holy of Holies, carried by priests whose role had been rehearsed for this singular moment, the cloud of glory descended. Scripture records that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, the weight of God's presence so overwhelming that trained men accustomed to sacred duties were driven to their knees. Solomon's prayer stretched across themes of covenant, forgiveness, and national identity. He asked God to hear prayers offered toward this place, to forgive sins confessed here, to regard this house as the point of contact between heaven and earth. The dedication sacrifice was staggering. 22,000 cattle, 120,000 sheep. Blood ran in channels designed to carry it away. The smell of burning meat filled Jerusalem and drifted across the surrounding hills. Celebration lasted 14 days, festival stretching into festival, the entire nation feasting on what remained of the sacrificial animals after the portions designated for God, and priests were consumed by altar fire. Yet even in triumph, questions lingered beneath celebration. Solomon had spent 7 years building God's house. He would spend 13 more years building his own palace complex, a detail Scripture records without comment, but which speaks volumes about priority and focus. The temple was complete, but the king's ambition was not, and the resources that had seemed limitless during construction would prove finite when the building stopped, but the taxation continued. The stones have fallen twice, the workers are long forgotten, but the God they unknowingly served through quarry dust and construction sites still stands, uncontained by any building, undiminished by any ruin, awaiting worshipers who understand that he desires hearts more than houses. The daily laborers who bled in quarries and collapsed on construction sites could not have known that their suffering pointed beyond itself, that the temple they built was always meant to be temporary, a shadow of something greater. When Jesus stood in Herod's temple and declared that he himself was the true temple, he was not diminishing their work, but fulfilling it. The real sanctuary was never made of stone, it was made of flesh, and it would be destroyed and raised in 3 days, not through human labor, but through divine power. The question remains for every generation: what are we building? At what cost? And for whose glory? The workers of Solomon's era built something that lasted 400 years before fire consumed it. What we construct with our days, our strength, our resources, will it outlast us? Or like the temple, will it point beyond itself to something eternal that no human hands can build and no human failure can destroy?